Let me introduce myself. I used to work at Google, then ran my startup FutureCam, then worked as CTO of another startup. I now work as a consulting CTO. Today we are going to talk about enums, enumerations, how to use them effectively. The first tip I have is to define what each of the states mean. Here, for example, notice that this enum represents both the camera and photo permissions. Maybe this should have been clearer. The combined status of camera and photo permissions. So we don't use two instances of this enum, one for camera, one for photo. We use one to represent the combined state. And the reason we do that is if either the camera or the photo permission is denied, the app can't work. So we don't really need to track whether camera was denied, photo was denied, or both were denied. All these three states are collapsed into one state called denied. The comment says either camera or photo permissions have been denied. So there isn't one right way to model your state. Model it based on how you'll be using it, based on rather than based on theoretical principles. Just make it easy for the user of the enum. And however you model it, define what it means. So for example, this is not perfectly modeled because what if one of them is denied and one of them is restricted? Is that captured as denied? Is that captured as restricted? So that is not defined well. So this is an area where we can improve this enum. But these two are defined well. And the location permission is not tracked by this enum because the app can work without location permission. So basically the purpose of the enum is to determine whether the app needs to stop working because necessary permissions have been either denied or restricted. Optional permissions we don't care about from this point of view. And notice that this enum is nested within permission requester. So it is the permission requester state. It's not some other kind of state, such as whether a video is being captured currently. Right? That is why permission requester dot state would be a better name than just state. That's why we nested it this way. Enums are sometimes used by only one class, in which case they can be private. So look at this state. This is the state of the shutter button. This is a helper enum. Think of it like a helper function. A helper function helps some other class. This enum helps this class. Its goal in life is just to make the implementation of this class easier to understand. And don't be lazy about this, about defining an enum. Don't pass around a bunch of booleans. So for example, this has three states. The shutter button is not yet pressed, which is the initial state when you open it. Then it is pressed, which means we are recording, then stopped. If you are lazy, you would do something like var pressed equal to true or false, whatever it may be. Var released equal to true or false. This is harder to understand that these two are related because if you model it this way, they are two independent variables. So for example, this is an invalid state. It has not been pressed, but it has been released. Like unless you pressed it, how can you release it? So such kind of illegal states can be represented if you use a bunch of independent variables, independent booleans, because you're lazy to define an enum. So don't do this. You can also define an underlying type of an enum in Swift. So here, for example, we are saying that each of the enum cases has an integer type. Whereas if you look at this enum, here you are saying that each of the cases has a string data type. So you can use whatever is appropriate. In this example, these are the three URLs that we open from our app: the privacy policy, an info page, and a why subscribe. So when you ask the user to pay, you see a button at the bottom says why subscribe. And if you tap it, this URL opens and it tells you what are the benefits you'll get from subscribing. So these are the three URLs we open. And in this case, making the underlying type of the enum a string works well because ultimately you have to open a URL. Whereas in the earlier case, we are working with some other API that uses numeric codes to represent different orientations. In this case, making the underlying type an integer avoids having to do a map. So suppose instead of this, we defined it this way. Then you would have to have a function code for, and then you'd have to do switch return 8 and so on. This is unnecessary code. It's better to do it this way. In Swift, similar to Java, enums can have values as well. They can have a bunch of properties. It need not just be a primitive type or an atomic type. It can be a struct with multiple things. So for example, suppose you have a payment type struct. Assume people can be paid in different ways within your company. So you could model two different things, right? One is a frequency of payment, the other is whether the payment is in advance. So if you've hired a consultant and you pay him in advance, let's say, right? So you can have one with multiple properties. When should you define an enum instead of a bunch of named constants? So what we could have done here is we could have said let diff orientation clockwise 270 equal to 8 and so on for the others. One is if we do this, let's write one more. This would be 6. This would be 90. So if you do this, you're anyway namespacing it by having this prefix. So this tells you these types are related, and this would be a better way of representing it. This also leads to better typing. If you do it, if you have a variable orient, which is of type diff orientation, you can be sure that it is a valid value. Whereas in this case, if you have a int, it can have any value. Now, whoever processes this needs to check that it is a valid value. It creates a potential for a runtime error. Whereas here, you can be sure that there's no runtime error. So anyway, these are some tips on using enums effectively. Hope you found this useful. If you'd like me to work with your team in improving code quality, there's a link in the description.